Of course, the Economic Outlook seminar is about forecasting. It's about trying to tell the future for Montana's economy and for the economy of our individual communities. Sometimes predictions look pretty good, especially long after they've been made. I want to give you one example of that. And again, I turn back to 1912, 100 years ago. A chocolate factory in France decided to, in order to market its product, to include some picture cards with its chocolates. And I've seen some of these, and one in particular really struck me. The artist who created these cards included one image showing a French woman in period clothing, seated at a desk, holding a telephone handset. And there's a gentleman at her shoulder. But projected on the wall is an image of another gentleman holding a similar telephone handset in what appears to be China. It was an artist's conception of the very first video telephone. And of course now, between computers, smartphones, Skype, and other programs, we can do exactly what that artist in 1912 envisioned. We can actually call around the world and see who we're calling. So sometimes predictions turn out pretty well, even if it takes almost a century for them to come true. We're now going to talk about some individual aspects of Montana's economy, beginning with non-resident travel, or what we conveniently call tourism. And predictions are difficult in this area. A year ago, who would have figured that it would take till almost the middle of July for Going to the Sun Road to fully open, or that some trails in Glacier National Park might be closed for the entire season? Who could have predicted that the rainfall and the snowmelt would have had the effect on Montana's recreation rivers that it had? But nonetheless, Norma Nickerson at the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research does her best to give us an idea of what's coming up. So Norma, tell us about non-resident travel.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. You're juiced up again now. You got your coffee, so we're ready to go. So before I even get started, I just want to set the stage about the travel industry, non-resident travel in Montana. It's about a $2 billion increase in dollars that are placed in Montana based on non-residents driving, flying in, pulling out their wallets and dropping money here. And it's about, they affect exactly, well, not exactly, nearly 25,000 direct jobs. And you add it all up with the indirect jobs and the combined everything, it's about a $34,000 or 34,000 job industry that the non-resident travel itself is supporting in the state of Montana. But let's look at national first. I always like to look at a bigger picture and then again look at the smaller picture, which is Montana in that case. But domestic travel, and that's just those of us who live in the United States, traveling in the United States, had a 2% growth in the United States. It was a slow growth, but it was growth nonetheless, which we obviously can see by this bar that it was up and down a little bit. And the title of my slide at the beginning of this, you know, is it a bumpy ride? Are we soaring? Are we gliding? What's going on there? And what you see in non-resident travel is it is a bit bumpy, but it always depends on the little things that are happening out there that make it bumpy. And obviously the recession had a huge bump in national as well as in Montana. But we don't see that happening all the time. And as long as there is population growth around the world, travel will continue to grow. Maybe down once in a while, but it will continue to grow. And where it's growing in the United States a lot is the international and the overseas visitors to the United States. And Montana is no exception to that. What's interesting is international refers to the North American part of that, Canadians and the Mexico people that are visiting Montana. Overseas is everybody else that's coming here. As you know, we've been pretty much on par with the dollar here and in Canada. And so we are a nice visit from Canada. We're right next door. There's a lot of things to do down here. And we are a foreign country to them. So we offer things that some people can't get up there. So the Canadian dollar, being good as it is, has really influenced a lot of people coming into the United States and Canada. The emerging economies, which are overseas, and that being the ones you're always hearing about, China, Brazil, and India, are now starting to have a middle class and a very large volume of a middle class. And because of that, once you get into that middle class status, all of a sudden you have a little bit more discretionary income, and travel becomes something that people want to do. In the United States, they're projecting a lot of growth from China and Brazil, and they're seeing that as it's occurring right now. The other thing that's going on with this projection of growth in international and overseas travel is just last week on January 19th, President Obama signed an executive order to improve the visa and the foreign visitor processing that people have to do to come into the United States. We don't know about it because we're here. It doesn't affect us. But anybody who wants to come visit the United States and many of those other countries has a big boundary in which they have to try to break through. And so the idea is to let's look at this and see what we can do to fix that. With that in mind, then at the U.S. level, they're saying they're expecting this continued growth in visitation from overseas to happen. In Montana, about 11% of our non-residents come from Canada, and about 3% of our non-residents are coming from overseas. Will that grow? Probably. And especially if the visa process improves. So what happened in Montana in 2011 compared to all the other years? This obviously goes back quite a ways. We got this is still preliminary, but it's looking more and more like this is going to be the case. In your little slide booklet there, I actually had it in there to be a slight decrease in 2011. Well, that's not true anymore as the numbers keep coming in. We're believing it's going to be flat in the number of individuals, non-residents, coming into the state of Montana. The business survey that we do of tourism businesses around the state would basically agree with this number as well. About 50% of the businesses in 2011 said they had an increase. About 50%, and most of those were saying that they stayed the same. And so in general, they're saying, yeah, we're about flat. And that's an interesting phenomenon because that's in the individuals that are coming to this state. What we're seeing is some behavior or change in that type of visitor. And the best way for me to explain that is the group size is decreasing. The group size is decreasing. So if you had a number of cars, think of the cars that come into the state. There's fewer people sitting in those cars, but more cars are coming in. And what that relates to then, hotels they're only selling to the group of people. And if a group is smaller, they don't care if there's 2 people in the room or 4 people in the room. They do care if it starts to get a little bigger than that, but that's another story. But anyway, the point is that hotels and admissions and things like that are actually on an increase a little bit because these are groups and people travel and pay in groups. And so while this number is flat, the spending is looking a little bit different. How do you compare us to the United States? And this is an interesting little graph that basically shows when Montana isn't doing as well as the United States, the next year it more or less flip-flops and we rebound and we do better than the United States in our visitation numbers and our growth patterns. And you'll see, obviously 2008 was big, and in 2008, Montana really got hit by those gas prices. Not quite as much as the United States because 90% of the people who come into the state of Montana are driving and they slowed down in their number of trips that they were taking. But then we came back in 2010 and not as much as the United States did. So it goes back and forth. So on a long line, we're basically the same, but it changes slightly from year to year. Back to that room idea in hotel rooms and how, what are they selling? RevPAR means revenue per available room. And when you look at this slide, you will see that Montana actually, other than the oil and, the Saudi Arabia of North America, which is North Dakota, other than them, our revenue per available room in our motels outpaced all our neighboring states. And part of that is they're just bringing themselves up to what they used to be in 2007 and then going a little bit beyond there, and people are still paying these prices, so we are able to go up in those. And it's recovering. It's recovering well. Some of the indicators that we look at is the national park system in Montana to see what that visitation level is. And maybe you're not aware of this, maybe you are, but there's actually 6 national park units in the state of Montana. We all know about Glacier, and we all know about Yellowstone. There's also Little Bighorn Battlefield, Bighorn Canyon National Recreation Area, Big Hole National Battlefield, and Grant Coors Ranch. These are all National Park Service system within the state of Montana. Overall, those 6 units went down 12% in 2011 over what we had in 2010. But let's look at that a little closer because obviously the 2 drivers are Glacier and Yellowstone National Park. Interestingly about this is in Yellowstone, they actually predicted that there would be a 3rd year in a row of record visitation, and that did not happen. And I kind of look at that and go, well, I'm not that surprised because really it's hard to sustain record growth 3 years in a row. But it was still only down 7% from 2010, which means it was still their 2nd highest year they've ever had in terms of visitation. So that's an interesting little phenomenon that you look at. Glacier National Park, on the other hand, 20% decrease in visitation in 2011. Like Ian mentioned earlier, July 13th is, if you discount the other year that was the latest opening, and that was during the war, and it have different reasons for opening so late, this was the latest opening ever, and we all remember last year, and we understand why that went. And actually, the Beartooth Highway up in going from Red Lodge towards Yellowstone opened 2 weeks later. They generally always open Memorial Weekend. They couldn't do it this year either because of the snow, and all those little factors bring down those numbers for the parks. One that we don't look at all the time because in general, Amtrak doesn't bring into Montana lots and lots of people. But it is a service that exists at the High Line. They don't have the airport service that we all do, and so it's important to them. And they had a bad year too in terms of because of snow and rain. So weather does have an effect on tourism. The flooding in Minot, North Dakota, I don't know if you remember this, but last June they were flooded out, and Amtrak actually had to stop their service for nearly a month, meaning that people coming from the east couldn't get into Montana. And so that dropped their service quite a bit. The bright light in all of this is, of course, what La Nina did to Montana last year, and the ski areas in Montana experienced a 9% increase in their skier visits, which was a record-setting year for all the ski areas in the state of Montana. What's it going to do this year? Well, we already are behind what we had last year. November and December didn't produce the snow. We were all sitting on the edge waiting for that snow to come, and we got it last week. But you know what? That didn't happen throughout the whole state. So it's who knows where it's all going. The advantage, if you want to call it that, is that most of the western ski areas aren't doing well. Colorado isn't doing well. It's kind of funny. I have to admit it, I do go on Facebook once in a while, and a couple of my nephews were saying, we got to get skiing, and I have a niece that lives in Denver, and she said, well, I hear that Montana and Wyoming don't have any snow. We don't have the best, but it's still better than them. So, of course, I had to write back and say, now, wait a minute. There's good snow here. It just depends on where you want to go. So that's the thing that people who are skiing are looking at is where is that snow dropping at the moment so they can go to those areas. Looking at Missoula County, what do we have here in terms of non-resident dollars that are dropped in Missoula County? $230 million, and this is based on 2010 dollars. We're still working on the 2011 dollars right now. 9% of all non-resident dollars are dropped right here in Missoula County. A lot of it is going to gasoline because we're on the interstate. And that's, of course, where a lot of people are going to be driving through. Restaurant and bar, though, is the next biggest one at 24%. So if you can see where the dollars are dropping here based on non-resident, retail is 17. That one goes up and down as the economy is fluctuating and how much discretionary income people want to spend on those kinds of things, which would be souvenirs or other types of things. The airport deboardings is a fun one to look at. Now, this is representing only quarter 3. Because quarter 3 is generally the time when more people are out there traveling than any other time of the year. And what you see is this 10-year trend of a 26% increase in deboardings in the Missoula airport. While it's not the highest increase compared to all the other cities, we're right up there with the rest of them. It's a big increase. And you have to give credit to Allegiant Airlines, which is a big one, and now they're going to go to Oakland. And when you're sitting in a community like Missoula, and now we have that many more options, it's great for us. And it also brings people into the state who may not have flown directly into Montana or Missoula in the first place. So this is a nice increase to see, and we all appreciate it. But I am here to tell you that a lot of it is because of tourism that we get this. And the third quarter is the big one. Like the Oakland one is a seasonal thing, and Alaska Airlines going to Portland, it's a seasonal thing. Why do you think it's seasonal? That's when people are going to be traveling. What happened then, or what do we expect to happen in the United States in terms of domestic travel? They're saying about a 2% increase. It's slow growth, and Pat mentioned that earlier. He says it was a disappointment. I kind of beg to differ a little bit on that. It's not all that unusual when you look at what the growth pattern is in travel and tourism. It's around that 2-3% mark all the time. But anyway, 2% growth. 1.5% growth, another almost 2% growth is what they're predicting in the domestic travel industry around the state or around the United States. What are we expecting in Montana in general? Again, our business survey that we do every year in November, 48% of the tourism businesses, travel businesses, said that they expect a growth in 2012, and a lot of this is based on their inquiries, their bookings, their marketing that they're doing that might be a little bit different, and things that help them out a little bit more. And repeat customers always comes out on top of that. People like Montana, and they like to come back and do the same sorts of things with a little variety here and there. 40% of the people said they expect the same, and this year was a pretty good year for them. And if that's good, that means about a 2% growth overall. At the national level, like I mentioned, the 1.5% growth, almost 2% at the national level. But the international visitor growing faster than the domestic traveler in the United States. So with that, I think we have a couple minutes for questions.
We do have a couple minutes. So does anybody have a question for Norma on tourism, non-resident travel? Wow, you were incredibly thorough.
I love that.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Norma.
Ian.
Well, it's no surprise that healthcare continued to make news in 2011, and now in 2012, we know that more big news will be made, especially concerning national healthcare policy. Greg Davis follows healthcare for the Bureau, and he will give you the latest trends and developments in that area. Greg?
Thank you, Ian. I do follow healthcare. I'm not an expert in healthcare, and the longer I'm in the business, I don't believe there are any experts. Call your attention to the slide, the white piece there in the middle. That's Mrs. Beaton's toast sandwich. And to show you how tough times are all over the globe, that was reintroduced by the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK just last year on a worldwide challenge. That sandwich can be made for 7.5 pence, which I think, if I did my American conversion correctly, is about 13 cents. And the Chemistry Society is offering a reward of £200, which is about $318 American, for anyone to come up with a cheaper alternative sandwich. It's 3 slices of white bread, lightly toasted with butter on both sides of the interior piece. And we're so convinced that this is, in fact, tastier than you think it's what's for lunch today. Before I begin, Pat was talking about the slow recovery, and this is a true story. I'm not smart enough to make this up. My son yesterday interviewed in Portland, Oregon with a high-tech, upscale social media firm, whatever that means. And 2 nights ago, he called me to ask me my advice on what he should wear to this interview. And he said, the problem I'm having is all my peers are saying this is a Steve Jobs type interview. You go in jeans and a casual shirt because these are young upstart guys. The company's grown from 5 to 100 in 3 years. It's a Steve Jobs interview. Go in jeans. And I said, well, I don't know if I buy that. I'm kind of old school. I'd suggest you put on your suit. And without missing a beat, he said, "Dad, this is not a position for an economist, this is a creative position." So I'm going to apologize in advance for my non-creative portrayal of healthcare in the state of Montana. We're going to talk a little bit about what drives healthcare spending in this state. Then we're going to look at a few of the Affordable Care Act provisions that are already up and running and what impact they might have or are having in this state. And then we'll close with, I think, the Bureau's first ever estimate of healthcare earnings in the state of Montana over the next 3 years. So what does drive healthcare spending? Well, the American Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research just released a study, and they said it's pretty simple. It's the 5% of the population that does over half the spending. And it's primarily the elderly, females, and those on public insurance policies. Well, in Montana, I think it goes beyond that. Certainly income is a driver. We know, and particularly since the recession, that's what contributed to the great slowdown in healthcare growth, was the recession. On average, about a 1% increase in income should increase healthcare spending by about 0.5%, or in reverse direction as well. The proportion of females between the ages of 22 and 44, simply because on average they spend 75% more than their male counterparts, although I'm not sure that would be true for that couple. And then finally, the baby boomer tsunami that's already here, and the wave's just getting bigger. We have 15% of our population in today's terms, 65 and over, Medicare eligible. And within the next decade, there's going to be 1 in 5 of us that meet that category. Another interesting aside, there was a research firm that introduced a study that said, who is old in this country? The greatest generation believes 93 means you're old. Baby boomers, whose average age is about 57, think 77 is old. The Generation Xers, those around age 40, believe 71 is old. The millennials, those that are about 25, think 62 is old. So I guess the lesson to be learned there is don't sit next to the millennials. Okay, how did the recession affect healthcare spotlight, if you will? Well, we had the biggest decline in healthcare spending. By the way, we're going to update your charts that are in your book. We've got another year's worth of data, so make that 51 years. We've had the biggest decline in healthcare spending growth now in 51 years, under 4% 2 years in a row. We've never seen that. But we also happen to have, in the year 2009, the biggest decline in nominal GDP. So where are we with healthcare spending? As a percentage of GDP, it rose by over 1%, and that was the biggest increase in healthcare share of GDP in the history of the expenditure accounts. So healthcare continues to be in the spotlight despite the slower growth experienced over the last couple years. Healthcare is really big business in Montana. We talked about this last year, but I'll re-emphasize it. Over $7 billion in personal healthcare spending this year alone in this state. That's hospital care, physicians, chiropractors. When you go into Walgreens and buy something, that's all that kind of spending. And that's going to be over $8 billion in just 2 years by the year 2014. Healthcare share of the economy, lots of ways of measuring it. The broadest way is just to simply look at gross domestic product. And on that basis, it's 10% of our economy, 12% of the private share of that economy. In terms of healthcare earnings, it's 14% of all earnings in this state. So it's absolutely huge. And then finally, how about on growth rates? Well, if you look at growth in healthcare earnings over the last decade, they've been growing at twice the rate of overall earnings in this state. Now that may be about to change. We're seeing some downward trending there. So if you look at growth in GDP in the state of Montana and healthcare's growth rate, in all but 3 years, healthcare has grown faster. That's good news. But even more importantly, notice it's never gone negative, and that's not the case with GDP in general. Finally, if you look at the percentage increase in GDP for the latest years that we have, that's 2009 to 2010, healthcare was not a big contributor. It was the biggest contributor to growth in GDP. Only 7 other states in this country devote more of their economy to healthcare than does Montana. So it's big business in Montana. Okay, I'll move on to the Affordable Care Act. And this year and next, we have over 44 major provisions coming online. Several provisions are already online, and we'll go through some of those briefly here in just a minute, This year we've got accountable care organizations. You've probably heard a lot about that. We've got fees for prescription drug companies, hospital value-based reimbursement programs now, decreased Medicare payments for hospitals that have preventable readmissions, and the list goes on and on and on. But we're going to take that 44 and knock it down to 43. Because one of the provisions that was to begin this year, at least in terms of premium collections, was the CLASS Act. And I can never remember what that acronym stands for, but it was the long-term care policy that all of us were going to be automatically enrolled in, and then you could voluntarily opt out. We were to begin collecting premiums for that program this year. But the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services late last year went to our actuaries and he said, there's no way we can afford this program in the future, so why collect the premiums now? So let's walk through a few of these ACA provisions. One of the earliest was the tanning bed tax, and that was effective in July of 2010. Didn't turn out quite as lucrative as an income generator for the government as we thought. Nationally, they thought 26,000 businesses would pay this tax. Only 10,000 did. And the revenue that was collected, the taxes that were collected in 9 months of the program, equaled what they thought they were going to get in the first 3 months. So the IRS is scrambling and trying to find out why almost 12 or 13,000 businesses didn't pay this tax. A more popular provision is the ability to keep adults on your policy till age 26, and my son is one of those. He's 25 this year, turns 26 in August, so I'll be able to carry him through. So he's part of that dark line on the bottom, the grand uptick. 2.5 million young adults nationally have health insurance, primarily through their parents' policies. That's a very popular provision of the ACA. Another provision, and this is an update from what's in your handouts as well, it's now 4.2 million. Healthcare is a moving target here. It's the Early Retiree Reinsurance Program. And that was a program to reward both employers and retirees aged 55 to 64 by reducing their healthcare premiums. And that could be shared between the employer and the retiree. All the retiree didn't matter. Congress had set aside $5 billion for that program, expecting to limp into 2014. In May of last year, they stopped accepting applications. The program's maxed out. Just to carry the existing entities through will exhaust the funds. So that program is now closed. Interesting on this slide, however, is you'll notice almost all that money has gone to the public sector. Only 4% went to the private sector to help with their retiree health insurance costs. The business tax credit, the federal tax credit, was supposed to be simple, but it wasn't so simple. Only 5% of businesses nationally filed for that tax. And when the IRS found out why only 5%, well, time and effort was the primary reason. Businesses just said it wasn't worth my time. It certainly isn't worth my effort. But then the IRS also discovered that Form 8941, that's the one you fill out, didn't have all the necessary steps to calculate the tax, so that might have been part of the frustration. In Montana, 26,000 postcards were sent out to small businesses that may qualify. We estimate that fewer than 7,000 probably qualify for the full tax credit. And recall that tax credit is based on the proportion of the premium paid by the employer, as well as by the number of employees, the average wage for those employees, and then what few people know is there's actually a cap on the premium that can be applied toward that tax credit as well. So it wasn't so simple, not the revenue generator. A more popular provision of the ACA is the donut hole, and that's for Medicare Part D beneficiaries. After you spend almost $3,000, you're on your own until you spend about $5,000 and you enter catastrophic coverage. That's why it was called the donut hole. Well, the first year, in 2010, you got a $250 rebate if you fell in that hole. Last year, got a 7% discount on generics, 50% on brand name drugs. This year, it's 14% on generics and 50% off brand name drugs. And eventually by 2020, it'll be a 75% discount for all. You'll also see some statistics there for Missoula County, as well as Ravalli County on the number of Part D Medicare beneficiaries claiming that gap as well as their gap amount. Also new this year, or last year actually, was the Medicare no-cost preventive services. And I didn't list all the states here, but I compare us to a few. On that note, Montana doesn't do quite as well as the national average, if that's even the benchmark we want to compare us to. compares to. The free screenings included things like prostate exams, bone mass screenings, cervical cancer screenings, and the list goes on. The other program was the Medicare annual wellness visit. That's not the Welcome to Medicare exam. This is the exam that you qualify for once you've been in Medicare for 12 months or longer. And on that note, we're about at the national average on the proportion of our Medicare beneficiaries having that exam. And finally, if you're a person of means, your Medicare Part A, your medical insurance, and your Medicare Part D, your prescription drug coverage, if you're a person of means, you're paying heftier premiums. And given the rhetoric in Washington, this will probably even be ramped up more. And these would be the estimated premiums effective this year if you fall into these income class categories. The government hopes to raise $25 billion, save $25 billion rather, over the life of that program. $25 billion in Part A alone and another $11 billion in Part D. And then Medicare and Medicaid per enrollee spending. This was released just last year by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And you'll notice how big a chunk Medicare is of our personal health care spending, almost 20% of it. You'll also notice that the growth rates for both Medicare and Medicaid didn't fall during the recession. And in fact, on Medicaid, the growth rates picked up. And we all know why that's the case. Those are those falling incomes and people losing insurance and falling into Medicaid eligibility. It's interesting to note, however, Montana is the lowest Medicare per beneficiary state in the country. Not quite the case with Medicaid. We're 146% of the average there. Okay, finally on to personal health care spending and what impact that might be on health care earnings. Let's understand what earnings are first of all. It's more than just wages and salaries. It's also proprietor's income, the self-employed. And it's also employer contributions to social insurance programs. So it's a bigger, more comprehensive measure of buying power. If we map personal health care spending in Montana against health care earnings in Montana the year after. Why the year after? Well, statistically, it takes a little while for earnings to catch up to that health care spending. So this is all data that's unique to Montana, and we're going to map that for 20 years just to see if there is a relationship. If there isn't a relationship, it'll look like a shotgun. If there's a relationship, we'll be able to draw a line through it. And obviously, we can draw a line through this. There's a very nice relationship between healthcare spending in this state and then what transfers into healthcare earnings as defined. So we're going to use that information along with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services estimates of healthcare spending growth, both with the Affordable Care Act and without the Affordable Care Act. And this is what we get. In reality, we'll probably fall somewhere in between. Why somewhere in between? Well, already the Class Act is out. And in March, the Supreme Court hears the case against the Affordable Care Act. Depending on what happens there, we'll know in June. We may revert back down to healthcare earnings and healthcare spending growth estimates without the Affordable Care Act. Why the big bump up in 2015? It's the fact that healthcare earnings tend to lag that healthcare spending. And then finally on to recession and post-recession real earnings in the state of Montana. Notice that, and this is adjusted for inflation, it starts with the fourth quarter of 2007, the year the recession began, and you see what's happened to the earnings for all industries in Montana. Notice healthcare earnings. They've had a few hiccups along the way, a few downs, but it's never gone negative, and it's always maintained or stayed above pre-recession levels of earnings. And then finally, let's look at employment growth. Now, this is second quarter to second quarter, so we're losing a little information here. Why quarter two to quarter two? Well, quarter two is the latest data that we have. And you look at it for healthcare in Montana. I realize there's a lot of lines there. All industries in Montana, then contrast that with healthcare Missoula County and all employment Missoula County. And you'll notice there's a convergence, and that convergence well under 1%. And that's the trend that we're seeing in almost all of our markets for healthcare. There's a slowing down of employment growth, and I think that's nothing more than a little bit of an entrenchment by healthcare providers as they try to figure out what's coming down the line in terms of healthcare growth. And for you Ravalli County guests, here's the same for Ravalli County, same graph except tailored to Ravalli County healthcare growth. And there it's a little bit different. You've had a decline in healthcare employment growth, but still highly positive at over 2%. So the way we close all these forecasts out is what could go wrong, and actually quite a bit. The economic recovery, how soon and how fast, that's going to impact healthcare spending. Secondly, the challenge to the ACA, and there's really 4 major challenges, and 3 of them involve the individual mandate, whether Congress even had the authority to mandate it. The second is whether it is severable from the Affordable Care Act, and that's a big one, because if it's not ruled severable from the Affordable Care Act, if the individual mandate is out, the entire Health Care Act is out, and that includes the more popular provisions. The third concern with the individual mandate, and this is a likely scenario, the Supreme Court could say that's nothing more than a tax. And if it's a tax, you can't challenge it until it's enacted, and it's not enacted until the year 2014. And then finally, provider responses, or excuse me, historical reform experience. We don't have anything. I can't go back and look at past reforms in healthcare and use that to help predict where the state of Montana, let alone the country, is going. We just don't have that historical precedent. And then finally, the provider responses. And this is what amazes me the most. I have seen absolutely no modeling of provider responses to changes in healthcare policy. As an example, what would happen if docs really do face a 27% decline in their Medicare reimbursement rate? Would they really abandon Medicare patients? Might we go to concierge-type medicine? There's virtually been no modeling in terms of the provider response. And in economics, that's half the equation. We're trying to estimate what's going to happen to demand. How about the provider response? How might providers respond? And we just don't know. So on that note, I will take questions if there are any.
Again, we've got microphones available, so raise your hand if you'd like a mic to come to you. Greg, let me just ask, I know it's early in the implementation of the ACA, but I know that healthcare costs and insurance costs continue to rise at a double-digit rate. Can you make any analysis of the effect of the ACA so far on either not holding that down or actually creating some pressure so it didn't go up by more?
No. Are there other questions? Oh, the reason I can't is we're one of, well, more than a handful of states. There's about 12, 15 or so states that years ago established what's called an all-payers claim database. And usually that's done through a legislative mandate. Sometimes it's done voluntarily. And these are data-rich banks where researchers can get in and mine data from all payers of healthcare. And you can see geographical trends, trends by procedure. You can see if Medicaid patients are using emergency rooms at unusually high rates. And we don't have access to that kind of data in this state, although the state is pursuing such as we speak.
We do have a question over here.
Yeah, you brought up a couple of examples where the assumptions built into the act haven't quite panned out. What are some of the other ones that you're fearful of?
How long do you have? There will be, there's some 15, 17 provisions that I think are well up and running. Some have run much better than expected. Some have run much worse than, I haven't seen it'd be kind of an interesting exercise to do an accounting on a trend line. On average, are they about where we think we are? I think on the revenue side, the forecasts have been disappointing. The reality's been disappointing. It hasn't been bringing in the revenue that was expected. But we have to qualify that. This has been a really slow recovery. And even the CMS has constantly had to go back and readjust their forecast for where they think healthcare spending is going. And so there's so many factors, there's so many complexities to that equation, it's hard to isolate it to just say this is because of the Affordable Care Act.
Okay, time for one more, and we've got it here.
My question is about the chart on the top of page 52.
Okay.
I thought earlier we were talking about an increase in earnings being an increase in wages and salaries. And I'm curious, what are the increases there?
Recall, earnings are more than just wages and salaries. Earnings are wages and salaries, but it's also proprietor's income. And in Montana, proprietor's income is huge. Those are the self-employed. These are the individual doctors, not part of a clinic, chiropractors that operate out of a side room in their house. Plus, it includes employer-provided fringe benefits in the social insurance program. So it's a much more comprehensive measure. One comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, one comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison.
Thank you, Greg. Give him a hand. We again are pleased to have Professor George Haynes with us from Montana State University. George specializes in the economics of agriculture, which means not just keeping an eye on the markets and on supply and demand, but also keeping an eye on the weather and what's going on, not just in Montana, but around the country and even around the world. So, George, tell us what's the forecast for agriculture?
All right, thanks a lot, Ian. One of my colleagues down at MSU likes to say that this has been such a good agricultural year in Montana that some of these farmers and ranchers are even thinking about maybe paying some income taxes this year. It's been kind of one of those years in Montana. It's been, in fact, nationwide, we think this will be the biggest agricultural year since the Russian wheat embargo back in the early 1970s. We probably would have reached almost that level here in Montana had we had a little bit better production year here because of as you know, we had lots of moisture. So what's going on in agriculture in general? One of the big stories now is there's a lot of land coming out of Conservation Reserve Program. We expect between this 2011 and 2012, almost 1 million acres being released from Conservation Reserve Program. That has a lot to do with higher prices of wheat and a few other things. Probably the thing that makes me most enthused about what's going on in agriculture is one of the requests that we got from Toole County over at Shelby. We have a group that came to us about doing some additional beginning farmer program. They have 40 young people over in Shelby that have moved back on the places around there in Pend Oreille County as well. So we're really enthused about what we see going on in agriculture, and boy, are these interesting people that are moving back. You know, people with PhDs in nutrition, engineers, others that are going to bring over time, a new face in agriculture, I think, a lot of new opportunities available. Okay, so what about what happened last year? Perhaps the biggest story was wheat prices were way up, up over 25%. Wheat production in Montana was down some. We were down about 17%. The big part of that was in spring wheat production, as you know, and we'll talk about here to some detail about weather. Just not very good weather for that particular crop. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something new on the market with pulse crops. Montana's become an important lentil and peas producer here, and we'll see how important in a minute. And then we'll talk a little bit about organic ag and about some of the opportunities that I see in Montana and elsewhere in organic agriculture. The cattle market's even more optimistic. In fact, we heard prior to coming up here the other day of some calf contracts in Montana that are over $2 a pound. These ranchers out there know how to make money at $1 a pound, so needless to say, there's some big smiles on our ranchers' faces around here. The cattle herd in the U.S. and Montana continues to get smaller. As we'll see, demand for beef is also getting smaller, but the value of this cow herd in the U.S. is now the highest on record. So what happened in Montana last year, we weren't up quite as much as we were nationally, but we still had a very good year here. We're up somewhere in the 15 to 20% range in gross receipts, and most of that's going to translate into higher net profits for farmers and ranchers here as well. The big story was this moisture situation that we had. This is a drought map from mid-July. I'll tell you would never see a drought map without any yellow on it. Yellow indicates drought in Montana. There was just no drought. We had good moisture conditions throughout Montana. In fact, we had lots of moisture in Montana. In fact, too much moisture in a lot of parts of Montana. The important part of this was it was really an issue of rainfall on fields. It wasn't so much, there's a lot of land that was impacted by this heavy rainfall in snow runoff along the river valleys here, but there was also a huge impact, especially for our wheat people, just out in areas where there were any low spots. Out in eastern Montana, many of these places had around 8 inches of rain kind of in the later part of May and June, and it just didn't dry out. This is down in southern part of the state, down around Crow Agency. Local disasters all over the state of Montana, and all of them were moisture related. So we had this very, very unusual year here in the state of Montana, just to talk about just all the wet conditions. As we got into the fall, even the drought maps looked reasonably good, although we had an unusual thing happen. After about the 1st of July, we became really quite dry in Montana, and as we eased into September, you notice there's quite a bit of yellow on this map up here, but not so much out in the eastern part of the state, but we began to dry out pretty substantially, and it impacted the yields on especially our spring wheat crops that were planted late anyhow. Perhaps the biggest story of all wasn't here in Montana, but it was down south. And the Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas area just really dried out. In fact, I was down in Texas in November, and I'll tell you, their pastures there look like billiard tables. There's a little bit of grass growing down there now, but not very much. This has been a sustained drought. There's been huge herd reduction. Some of those people have gotten rid of 90% of their cattle there. Even today, we have just a lot of cows going to market as these people are reducing herds in the Southwest. But that's been good news for Montana cattle producers. That's the reason we have these $2 calves, is because we had this situation that existed down south of here. Okay, let's take a little bit look at the wheat market to start off with here. Wheat is our most important, our largest in terms of sales volume commodity. Notice that wheat exports as a percentage of production are down. In fact, we even think these numbers are adjusted to go down even further. So our wheat export market has lost a little momentum. The wheat export market for us is largely kind of a sub-Saharan Africa, Egypt, Japan, Mexico, Philippines market. That's about 50% of our wheat market. There's a lot of competition in the wheat market. That's one of the reasons our exports are lower. The Russians and Ukrainians, Kazakhstan now have had reasonable production years last year, and they're back in the international market, and they're back in the international markets with a real vengeance. They're out there to buy market share, and so they're undercutting wheat prices on just about all low-quality wheat. Here in the United States, we had an absolutely incredible year here when you begin to think about our wheat production. Look at these numbers over on the far right-hand side. These are the reductions in the amount of production in all of these major wheat producing states. North Dakota down by 43%, Kansas down 23%, Texas off 61%, Oklahoma down 42%, and so on. North Dakota is the only high moisture state. The others were all drought conditions. But we as Montana wheat producers up here benefited, of course, from all of these dry conditions that were south of here, and of course the situation over in North Dakota. The global story was a little bit less interesting. The most important line on this is the former Soviet Union countries. They came back to kind of normal production levels this past year, which they realized about a 36% increase in output. In the United States, we're down about 9% or thereabouts. So not too much else to talk about there. But again, the influence of the former Soviet Union countries in the export market is really critically important because they're so price aggressive. In Montana, our grain production here was kind of mixed. Most of it was off, the winter wheat crop was down just a little bit, and that's because, again, we dried out later on in the summer. But the spring wheat and the barley numbers were way down, and that's because either these people didn't plant anything. You know, we had 500,000 acres in Montana that really weren't planted last year. It's about 8% or so of our production acreage here. And then we had this summer that dried out when these guys planted late, and then they had this really relatively dry summer, and so the yields were down as well. Prices were up on just about everything. The wheat prices, the spring wheat and winter wheat prices were way up. We had very good price conditions there. Barley prices are a little bit hard to read on this because this isn't because barley prices were generally down a lot. It's just that in Montana, we ended up having a lot of our barley that was being sold to the beer the beer manufacturers here not make malt, and so with not making malt, these prices were somewhat lower than otherwise because they sold it on the regular market. One of the interesting stories in Montana is with hay production. I have a nephew up in central Montana that buys a lot of hay, and I said, well, where are you shipping this down to Texas? He said, no, it's not going to Texas, it's going to Idaho. I said, why is it going to Idaho? He said, well, because they cube it in Idaho and they ship it to Asia. So there's another market for hay that's evolving out there, and it's really kind of interesting in Montana. I think in fact, I'm quite optimistic about hay prices here because of this. There's apparently a very good demand, and I think we're going to see maybe a little uptick in hay production in the state as well as in prices of hay. You notice that prices last year kind of came back to kind of some long-term historical norm. I think we're going to move above that. And with the right kind of weather conditions, we'll have some more hay to export. Another interesting crops in Montana have to do with pulses. We don't talk about pulses very much. In fact, we have a pulse expert at Montana State that everybody up till a few years ago used to give him quite a hard time about where it really fit in the Montana crop mix. There's good reasons for pulse crops because they do fix some nitrogen, so you can plant them every 1 out of 3 or 4 years. Look at these numbers. Lentils, peas in particular have become a relatively big deal in Montana. These are the number of pounds of those. Those are the two top lines. We haven't done so well with beans, but we've become an important lentils and peas producer. And one of the reasons we become a relatively good lentils and peas producer is because prices are pretty good, even though there's a lot of volatility in these prices. The stories you hear from the grain or the pulse traders are amazing. We think about wheat prices kind of being like this. Well, pulse prices can go up and down just on a day-to-day basis. Go from 19 cents a pound one day down to 4 or 5 cents the next day and back up to 15 cents the next day. That's kind of the pulse market, so lots of volatility. The most amazing part is that Montana now is a major pulse producer. In fact, in lentils, we produce, look over on the far right-hand side of this, we now produce almost 40% of the lentils that are grown in the U.S., around 29% of the peas, and then almost half of the winter peas that are grown here in the U.S. So we become a very important producer there. It's really changed the relationship, though, with farmers when they go to the elevator, because they used to be able to take their wheat into the elevator, and if the wheat crop had a little bit of trash in it and other things, they discount them a little bit and go ahead and buy the wheat and clean it. With pulse crops, Pakistan, India in particular, want high-quality lentils and peas, and if these crops come in out of the field with any trash in them, the farmer gets a chance to take them home. So it's really been a very different relationship with elevators, with some of our producers in getting used to selling peas and lentils into this market. Okay, organic products are another growth area. In fact, organics will be about 4% of what we buy at the grocery store probably. Where's money being made in the organic market? I think this graph shows a lot. If you look at it's one of the graphs that's actually not in your book. If you look at the two lines that are on top of this, these are the margins that these businesses are making over conventional prices. So if you look at the graph here, there's a couple that are way out there. The top line there is organic eggs, and they sell for, maybe 2.5 times or 3 times what you would pay for conventional eggs. The other one that's a straight line kind of running across at about the 150% range is milk. So the big products out there are eggs and milk. And unfortunately in Montana, we don't make a lot of money off of either one of those because we don't produce very much of them. But there's some market opportunities there that some people are gradually working their way into. The Hutterites in particular have some interest in these areas. The one that's probably most important to us is the one that's running across the bottom there. It's the red line, which actually is below the line, or right at about 0. That suggests that if you're, with our grain that we're producing in Montana, organic grains that are here, that they're being priced at about the same level as conventional grain. That might be for some of the grain that we're growing here, but for the kamut and some of the other grains that we're growing up in north central Montana here, they're being sold on the market now for about 1.5 times or so what conventional grain prices are. I was talking to one of the major grain millers in Montana. We spent about 3 days together this fall, and he was saying, hey, that's where the market's going to be in Montana. We think there's huge potential in organic grains. And Montana has a lot of ability to produce those. Go back to the CRP that's coming out. CRP ground is ideal for growing organic grains because we haven't had any fertilizers or chemicals on that property. So it's going to be an interesting look at this market as we move into the next year or so. So what do futures prices look for grain? Again, think about these farmers. A lot of them know how to do pretty well on about $5.50 grain. They're looking at nearly $8 on there's spring wheat that's out there, about $1 less on their winter wheat. The thing that's still driving a lot of this market is corn. Corn prices have remained very high. Wheat's a substitute for corn. When corn prices get high enough, they use wheat to feed the cattle. Not the wheat that we grow here in Montana much, but some of the lower quality wheat in the southern U.S. So what do we think is going on? Winter wheat plantings actually in Montana are down just a little bit. The winter wheat crop in Montana is not very good. I was in Great Falls yesterday, or the day before yesterday, and the wind was blowing over there. So whatever is left of that winter wheat crop is probably gone to zero by now. The important thing is with corn, though, because corn's this important substitute that's out there, and a couple things going on. We no longer have blended credits for ethanol. Those all went away. We no longer have tariffs on ethanol coming in from Brazil. Those aren't there either. That's probably driven the price of corn down by 40 cents or thereabouts. We're all concerned about the renewable fuel standard. We think if that goes away, that we'll see these numbers, plummet. In fact, we think the price of corn will go down by a third probably. So that's kind of what's hanging around out there on the public policy arena. Okay, I suggested before that demand for beef's off a little bit. This has been a long-term trend actually in beef. The exports for beef are way up. It's one of the really shining parts of the entire agricultural complex, up by about 20%, and expected to go up a little bit more next year, although we've made such huge progress this year. Look at those numbers of increases in beef exports to Japan, up 38%, South Korea up 50%, Canada up about almost 40%, Russia, a new market for us, up about 72%. So things are really looking good for the beef export market. But again, it's going to slow down a little bit, I think, next year likely. Montana cattle herd continues to get a little bit smaller as it does nationwide. Calf prices are just off the charts right at the moment. Whether they're going to remain that high, I don't know. But like I was telling you, we've heard these stories about these very high calf prices. The top of this graph is $180 per hundredweight, $1.80 a pound. This most recent calf contracts are way off of this chart. They're 20 cents higher than this chart, $200 more per hundredweight than this chart even goes. So what are these cattlemen looking at for this fall? Again, these cattle guys in Montana know how to make money at about $1 or $1.10. They're looking at prices in the $1.50 range for their cattle, or for their calves, and I think they're going to be higher than that likely if some of these longer-term contracts hold true. We primarily just take a look at the feeder cattle line there. That's really the one that matters most to us. But very optimistic producers that are out there at the moment. So what do we see in this cattle market? Strong prices, as I've already talked about before. Really looking for these emerging economies to come through for us. That's a really big part of our export market. Of course, strength of the U.S. dollar is also a critical piece as we try to export these products out as well. As I've talked here in, I think, 3 or 4 years in a row here, we see a lot of potential to see the U.S. cattle herd get bigger. That all takes time. And boy, the number of cattle continue to decline. There seems to be some interest now in seeing this cattle herd get larger. That you take a heifer calf out of a herd today and breed that heifer calf and get a calf that's 2 or 3 years down the line. It's going to take some time, and we're very optimistic actually about this cattle market over about the next 2 or 3 years, just because herd replacement is going to take some time to rebuild. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have about agriculture.
And again, raise your hand high. A mic will come to you. George, you mentioned some public policy things. Now, obviously, the market forces. There have been significant changes in federal nutritional guidelines, and I believe the school nutritional guidelines just were revised. Does that have any strong impact on Montana producers?
Well, I think anytime you have nutritional guidelines that change, you are asking producers to somehow bring those products to the market. And, given the large number of the size of that market, with schools in particular that are buying these products, sure, it has impact on what we might try to produce. The challenge with that is, though, that how do we do that locally? And I think there's a lot of interest in locally growing now, even in our school district in Bozeman there is. And how do you have a constant supply of product that you can then take from these local growers and then bring it in and satisfy some of these nutritional guidelines and this desire to buy local in your local school districts? That's another substantial challenge.
We have a question over here.
On bean prices, I noticed if I was looking at that right, bean prices are really high, but we're very low in production. Is that due to it's a lot more capital intensive to harvest beans, or is it just farmers just choose to go a different route? If the price is really high, can they ramp up more production?
Well, now it's just a kind of a crop production choice with beans, I think, as much as anything. And if we end up seeing those prices remain high, I guess we'll expect to see some movement toward pinto beans and other things that are here. But it's really just a crop rotation choice at this point.
All right, well, thank you, George. Let's take another 10-minute break, and we'll come back beginning with real estate. You've already met some of the folks from the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, but we have quite a few more with us today because we, of course, are in Missoula, where the Bureau is located. Among those that are here today are, of course, Pat Barkey, the director. You've heard from him. Eric Berg, who's a research forester. Jennifer Calder, the outreach coordinator for Montana Kids Count. Bob Campbell, who's a programmer. Greg Davis, of course, you've heard from on healthcare. Christina Henderson, who's the marketing director and events coordinator. Shannon Furness, the publications director. Charles Gale, research assistant. We've got research forester Steve Hayes. Chuck Keegan, you remember, is a forest industry researcher and has been a part of these for many, many years. Chelsea McIver, one of the research assistants. Todd Morgan, you're going to be hearing from very shortly. Paul Polson, you've heard from already, longtime director and now director emeritus. Deborah Simmons, who's the office manager for the Bureau. Eric Simmons, one of the research associates. Colin Sorensen, who is a research economist. Jim Sylvester, who is an economist and also the director of survey operations. Allison Talaska is the interviewer for the Bureau. Shanice Waldo is the office assistant. We also want to recognize Mike Harrington, who's the associate dean of the UM School of Business Administration, and also we want to recognize the faculty and staff from the University of Montana. So all of those folks have had a hand in making these seminars possible and in making the operations of the Bureau possible. And I think we all recognize that the Bureau has really become an institution in Montana. And judging from the turnout that we've seen, not just in Missoula, but in Helena and in Great Falls so far, these Economic Outlook seminars are just a great success. So please give a hand to all of those folks at the Bureau. We have been privileged the last few years to have Scott Rickard with us to talk about real estate in Montana. Scott directs the Center for Applied Economic Research at MSU Billings and has really helped us understand the dramatic events affecting real estate and housing markets in recent years. So what's coming in 2012? For an answer, let's welcome Scott Rickard.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Pat Barkey and the BBER for asking me to participate in this. I really appreciate that. I also need to thank MSU Billings for its support of the center throughout the years. It's really been a necessity. I think what I enjoy most about this is the ability to interact one-on-one with a cross-section of the industry folks and other industry folks around the state. You really, if you're open to it, you learn a lot just in these informal interactions. A personal example, last summer my daughter broke my iPad. She was running across the barn to show me her new high score on Angry Birds, flips upside down, crashes, it's gone. And I noticed as I was showing around the next few weeks and telling people the story about it, basically most people would look at that broken thing like it was something alive, and it would be, oh my, that's horrible, can it be fixed? But it was interesting, I had this certain subset of people that wouldn't even look at it, they would just lean into me and go, what was her score? That probably gave more information away than the person usually expected, but sometimes you find out more than you expect. Let's start out with the national conditions for home sales across the U.S. First thing we have to remember is we're coming off a 5-year period where there has been drastic declines. You're not going to find exactly the same slides in the book. I've been updating them since we started based upon feedback. They will all be, the final one will be published on our website, msubillings.edu, as soon as I get back. Noticing, basically except for this stretch of states right through the center, we've got on both ends of the country, we have areas where we're seeing 25% or more decline over the past 5 years. Now, taking it down for 2011, existing home sales were at 4.26 million was the final count for the year. Since about 2008, that number has been averaging 4.1, 4.2. So we're seeing a slight increase. The December numbers were actually a little bit higher if you take that rate, right? Looking at median price, 164,500. That's down about 2.5% year over year. Now, comparing that to new construction, 607,000 starts were reported. 429 of those were single family. Median price for a new, 212,000. That premium of compared to the 164,000 for existing, that's about twice as high as we see typically. And that is one observation there that's consistent with this idea that existing home sales, those prices are being held down by some factors. Foreclosure rate, just this is the December heat map basically, but you look at it from the annual, you get the same idea. Basically, we have several states that are experiencing a significant number of homes on the in foreclosure. Give you an idea of what the prices are, average prices in some of these states. In Michigan, the average price for a home sold in 2011 was $60,000. Ohio, $83,000. You look at Florida, Nevada, $110,000, $120,000 for average price. Even California, the average price was only $237,000 for a home that did sell. So that is considerably lower than it was several years ago. At the national level, my number one concern continues to be the shadow inventory. That's not just the homes that are actually for sale, but the large quantity of homes that are out there that potentially will enter the market for sale. Right now, we basically have about 1.5 million homes in foreclosure. Another 3.5 are delinquent or seriously delinquent. And we have 9 million homes currently, is the estimate, are underwater. It's 14 million homes in total. Let's say only half of those end up actually end up back on the market. 7 million homes. When you've got sales quantities of only 4 million, 4.25 million, that represents a considerable additional supply, which can help can continue to hold the prices down. Looking at the regional conditions, Montana and surrounding states, except for North Dakota, we saw an increase at least at 1% in Montana, more in some of the other surrounding states. Most was in Wyoming, but then again, they start at a fairly low base. North Dakota, a bit of a special case for two reasons. Number one, you've got the temporary housing demand for the workers in the Bakken. If it has a roof and it can stop the wind, then you've got something you can rent for a considerable amount of money. We also have to remember that the floods last summer took out quite a few homes, and those homes probably, a lot of those people would like to be selling them. However, they're not exactly part of the housing stock currently until they're fixed. 12-month price change, price value, this is index-based, 2.7% for Montana, decline. We have a mixture of ups and downs. Highest increase was in North Dakota, consistent with increased demand for at least that temporary housing. That almost 9% decline for Idaho is the largest decline, and that is considerable. Looking specifically at foreclosures, we only had about 2% of Montana's homes are currently listed in foreclosure, and another 4% considered delinquent. That's 6% total for in foreclosure or delinquent is about the same as Wyoming and South Dakota, same numbers. Only North Dakota with a 1% foreclosure, 3% delinquency rate is lower. Now comparing that, looking at Florida, estimates are 14% in foreclosure, 9% delinquent. One analyst that's looking at, at least has looked at that issue of distressed sales, what are they doing to the market, took his portfolio of the homes that they had covered and looked at what was the price change for those single-family homes that were considered distressed versus those that were not. Basically, and just looking at his estimates for this region, the green line would represent what the price change would be if we did not have the problems with distressed housing. And as you'll see in Montana for this portfolio, it's a difference between a slight decline in price and a 4% price increase. So, and this is consistent with most of the surrounding states. This is consistent with we have issues that distressed housing on the market is leading to price declines, or at least a lack of growth. Looking at metro area prices, you'll see for the most part they are following what the state averages are. Biggest difference would be Boise at a 13% decline for that metro area, as opposed to 8.5–9% decline for the state as a whole. I didn't list it. Denver, we've got a Denver metro 3% decline. Spokane 7.5% decline. Now, to drill it down to the county level, what I did is I used publicly available data that's been reported on the different metro areas in Montana for the first 9 months of 2011. And we're looking at two things: number of sales reported and median prices for that period. You'll notice that except for Gallatin County, based upon that metric, we saw a decline in the number of sales in all of these areas. Cascade County, it was a 10% decline, 5% estimated in Missoula and Yellowstone for the first 9 months. Flathead down 1%. Lewis and Clark basically just a tiny amount, about a 12% increase in the number of transactions in Gallatin. But then again, they did fall considerably in the previous few years. Looking at median prices, we saw a mix. We actually saw a few that did have an increase in median price. Cascade County grew slightly. Missoula, 3.3% increase in median price for the first 9 months listed. Now that goes all the way down to Flathead. We saw a 9% decline in the median price for that same period. Another way to look at it is you say, okay, in a healthy market, what do we want to see? We want to see home values up, and we want to see number of sales up. That would be consistent with the upper right corner of this graph, right? And you could still have a growing market if you had values declining a little, but the number of transactions more than increasing to more than compensate that, or vice versa. We saw fewer transactions, but the number of sales truly increased enough to more than compensate for that. Based upon that metric would be everything to the right of the dashed line, and we only have, for the first 9 months, only Gallatin would meet that. For Missoula, we did see Cascade, we see increase in prices, but in median prices, but the decline in sales more than compensate that. And looking at housing starts, there's nothing more to say that it was bad. Look at the decline from the peak. Even Silverbow with only 25%. We're seeing 50% declines in most of the other areas. And we also have to remember there are several counties in rural Montana that basically there was no construction in the past year, and it is entirely dried up. Another thing that should be noted on the different metro level MLS is it was striking the difference of days on market between the different areas. For example, days on market in Yellowstone County went up, but it went up by 12 days, but still it's only standing at 72 days, as opposed to in Lewis and Clark or Missoula, days on market are more than double, or right at double that. So, as I've said before, just figuring out a couple of years ago, if you've got a house that you are trying to sell and you have to hang on to it for 2 more months, if you've got a mortgage on it, that's almost the equivalent of losing a 1% price just in the carrying costs of it. Forecast, I do believe we'll see an increase in the number of new homes sold in 2012 around the state. It's not going to be spec homes, but I believe that there is a pent-up demand for those folks and those households that are secure enough and able to afford this. Existing homes, I'm really not sure. I believe we have as many downside risks as we do upside. I would be happy if we saw an increase in it. I'm just not really sure that the numbers, at least for Montana, characterize it yet. Sales prices, I think we still have some more decline. I believe that we have quite a few distressed homes and homes that are in that shadow market that are going to be coming to light in the next year or two, and that will continue to hold a lid on prices. And rents, I think we'll see an increase in rents trending up as we see more people in the family formation stage continuing to opt to rent as opposed to buy. What are our risks? Right now, I'm most concerned about such things as NAR, National Association of Realtors, reported in December, a third of the pending sales fell through. For a large number of these, it was because the appraised value did not match what was needed in order to get through with the complete the transaction. Excuse me. I'm concerned about such things as in 2008, at the peak, the total value of residential investment was $23 trillion, 23 trillion, and just this last year it was estimated at 16 trillion. It's a huge decline in the value of the home stock that's out there for the homeowners. And take that 16 trillion and add to it the fact that we've got $10 trillion in single-family home mortgage debt. So that really takes down what the average equity is. Also, take it down another step. We have basically 2/3 of the homes are the ones that have mortgages. A third of the homes, there are no liens on them. The people own them. So if you take it down to just the people that have mortgages and amortize out that debt, we're looking at an average equity level of around 25%. Right? It takes 20% down now. So now we're saying that there is a considerable fraction of existing homeowners that will have to come up with more money just to meet the down if they're trying to sell their home and then buy something else even at the same price level. I'm also concerned that estimates are about a third of the sales are still running distressed, and as long as we have that influence, and it will continue to be an issue. General economic slowdown, yep, we've got that possibility. And last, we've just got little issues like the loss of mortgage interest, or mortgage insurance deduction. If that isn't re-upped, that represents $100 or so pragmatically for a new loan, for a new mortgage, and that's going to affect some individuals. So a few years ago, I ran through what you get for the money, just looking at different price points, trying to see, what the comparison is there. And I thought I would go through it again, just to see. This is from several sources, and I was not able to find enough information for all the reporting areas. Just basically looking at it, I based it on, for $150,000, Lewis and Clark County, 1,500 square feet, 3-bedroom, or 2-bedroom, 1 bath. If it was in a town, it was on about an 8,000 square foot lot, 30 years old. That same $150,000 in Flathead, larger, 1,800 square feet, you could get another bedroom and another bathroom. Cascade County, even larger, 2,000 square feet, or it could be located in Great Falls. And that was one thing I found in general, which I found a little interesting, is you're just, basically there was about a 20 or 25% premium at this end of the market for a home located inside the major city versus outside. Bozeman, Great Falls, Missoula, and Billings. And Yellowstone, we have another 2,000 square feet compared to that 1,500 for the baseline, 3.2. Younger homes, 6, it comes out to basically 10 years, just younger than the existing, or an attached garage that seemed to have some value to it. And then I took it up to 250,000, just look there, and there the baseline would be Gallatin, 2,400 square feet, 3.2 on a quarter acre, 20 years old. This wouldn't be in the city. This exact same thing in the city would be more like 280, 290,000. That same 250,000, you can get more in Cascade or Lewis and Clark, maybe a 3rd bath and a younger property. And again, just for an examination, I was trying to see, okay, what is that water access worth at $250,000 in Flathead County? So I looked at it. Water access was worth, you could basically was looking at 2,000 square feet, 3.2 on a lot. Or if you wanted to be able to get that boat there, you could get 1,000 square feet. Right, one, but as a double check, talking to someone or a couple people up there, they said basically, really, either of those two iterations, you're just looking at some place that that it's the location, and most probably, if it was purchased, they'd scrape it and build something new on it. Either way. And $350,000, which 4 years ago was a viable cost segment, you could get just about anything you wanted other than some of the resort areas. It's very much location related, or land is what you got if you're looking at that price. And since I'm talking about rentals and apartments, just briefly, we went through the newspaper listings for the fall the different areas, and we looked at what the 1, 2, and 3 bedroom apartments were bringing. Basically, $450 to $625. Missoula had the highest for a one bedroom apartment. And looking at 2, we're moving all the way up towards $700. Most of them that 640 is my average. It's like 610 up to like 650. I was just trying to compartmentalize it. And a 3-bedroom one, 650 was the cheapest in Butte, all the way up to $1,100 in Helena or Bozeman. And one other thing I thought was interesting there was that gradient on apartments, and it was interesting to me that Missoula was the most expensive to get into that 1 bedroom, but then to go to a 2 or 3 bedroom was only about 10% more each. So it was just getting the apartment was the most expensive thing, and then larger did not appear to be as much of an issue. Now that really strongly compares to such places as Billings, Great Falls, Helena, where basically each additional bedroom was adding like 40% more to that initial price. And now since I'm talking about houses, we did have house rental information there that we could pick up. That difference, $450 for that 1 bedroom in Great Falls, all the way up to $600 in Billings. That was a case we didn't have that many listings there for rentals. But then 2 bedrooms, $700, all the way up to $1,000 plus Bozeman and Missoula for a 2 bedroom. And 3 bedroom, you notice for the most part, and $1,300. Now you get into, okay, what's the trade-off between home rental? If we potentially could be having a lot of these homes coming into the market as rental, at least temporarily, so what is that going to do to the apartment market? So looking at what's the premium, first of all, for a one-bedroom house as opposed to an one-bedroom apartment? And in Great Falls and Helena, same price. You could basically get 1 bedroom either. Now, it doesn't say anything about location, and that is always important. The premium in Butte's only 20% for a house, and it's about a 35% premium for a house compared to 1-bedroom apartment in Billings. And 2-bedroom, you'll notice 25% to all the way up to 50% premium for that house as opposed to the apartment. What really gets interesting, though, when you think about it, a 2-bedroom house is a lot more adjustable than a 3-bedroom apartment. So really, that could be a valid comparison. So what's the premium for a 2-bedroom house as opposed to a 3-bedroom apartment? Well, for just about all the areas that we looked at, it's, if not cheaper, it's as cheap. So basically, we're looking at if you are or if you happen to be an owner of 3-bedroom apartments, I believe your biggest additional competition right now will be the 2-bedroom house. And there's a lot of 2-bedroom houses out there that may well be entering the market. That's all I have. I'd appreciate the chance to answer any questions, except I don't remember what her score was in Angry Birds.
Scott, while we see if there's any questions from the audience, what can you say about interest rates and qualification criteria that may go through the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, we saw the Fed announcing they're going to keep the interest rates low for another few years, and that, I guess that's a good thing if you're consuming something that's going to be tied to that interest rate. It's a bad thing, and what their outlook is for the next few years. We're looking at interest rates, 4% right at that, or even lower. I'm much more concerned about how many people qualify. And just anecdotally talking to both agents and talking to the title companies, that seems to be a big issue. People qualifying, and there's a lot of self-selection. Even a lot of people are not even looking because they just feel they won't qualify, and I find that's going to have to be a public sentiment kind of thing that has to turn around before we're going to see a lot of growth.
Thank you, Scott.